On Halloween night, Grave Explorations had the privilege to take part in a rare tour of old Spadra Pioneer Cemetery, and I am inviting you to walk with me across the river where we will mingle with the ghosts of the past. Hidden behind these iron gates is what remains of a once thriving community that faded into history long ago. We make our way down an overgrown path that not only leads to our destination, but seemingly to another time. Our first visit is to the grave of Pearl Scott Hopp. Young Pearl was the wife of a farmer, and following the death of their first child, she became distraught. Finding little comfort in her husband, she fell into the arms of farmhand Lee Smith. The story goes that Pearl took $160, the sum total of her husband's savings, and ran off to Los Angeles with Lee. When the money ran out, Pearl begged her husband to take her back, which he did, but her heart still belonged to the young farmhand. It was not long before he came calling, and the lovers secretly renewed their relationship. One day while at work, Pearl's husband heard 2 gunshots. He followed the sound to a peach orchard where he discovered the bodies of the 2 lovers. It was ruled a murder-suicide, but in fact the star-crossed couple decided that since they could not live apart, they would instead die together. Pearl's last request was that she be buried beside Lee, but instead she rests beneath this concrete slab at Spadra, while the bones of her lover lie a few miles away in Pomona Cemetery. Our next visit is to a man who was once the richest landowner in Los Angeles County. Louis Phillips came to Spadra in 1862 to manage the vast Rancho San Jose de Abajo. The land was in the midst of a hotly contested foreclosure that often erupted into violence. The hostile environment made the new owners eager to unload the property, and they quickly struck a deal with Phillips. In the next few years, Spadra boomed. The railroad brought freight through the area, and the Butterfield stage brought new settlers. In 1875, Phillips replaced his old adobe with a grand Second Empire mansion at the heart of his thriving community. The house stands to this day and is preserved by the Pomona Valley Historical Society. Sadly, Phillips' vision of turning Spadra into a metropolis never happened. By the 1890s, the railroad moved its terminus further east, and people began settling in the nearby town of Pomona. In the 1860s, Phillips donated a small plot of land not far from his home as a community cemetery. The area had long been a burying ground, but now it would have its own foundation to look after its upkeep. And when Louis Phillips died of pneumonia at age 69, he was laid to rest here in the only place that still bears the name of his beloved Spadra. Near the Phillips grave is the striking headstone that depicts the famous sculpture by James Earl Frazier called The End of the Trail. It marks the resting place of Ursula Meyer, who died at age 32. She met her demise less than 2 months after marrying her 3rd husband. It was said that the two had quarreled, after which she committed suicide by poisoning. Her family claimed that she was happy and had no reason to end her life. That, plus the fact that she didn't leave a suicide note, gave way to speculation that she might have been murdered. Her body was returned to Pomona, where she lived, and was laid to rest in Spadra, where some time later this elaborate stone was placed. It is unknown why her name is listed as Ursula when it was actually Elabel, and the identity of the stone's buyer remained anonymous. These are just a few of the mysteries surrounding Elabel, mysteries that in the 9 decades following her death have grown darker with each passing year. This is the grave of Benjamin Franklin Bowers, who, like many idealistic young men, enlisted in the Army when the American Civil War broke out. As part of Company F of the 14th Iowa Infantry, Franklin saw combat in the Western campaign of the war. In April 1862, he fought at the Hornet's Nest during the Battle of Shiloh. Wounded during the battle, Bauer spent 3 months in an Army hospital before he was discharged. He went back to farming and later moved west to California to begin a new life. Haunted by the carnage he witnessed, he also hoped to free himself from the tortured memories of the war. This toppled monument marks the grave of Melinda Arnett, who died on December 23, 1868. She was the first official interment at Spadra Cemetery. Melinda's husband Robert also rests here, as well as 5 of their 6 children. This is the burial plot of William Wiley Rubottom and family. Affectionately known as Uncle Billy, he was one of the earliest settlers in the area, and he proposed naming it Spadra after his hometown in Arkansas. He built an inn less than a mile from the cemetery on the road used by travelers going to and from Los Angeles. It was a lawless time in the region's history, with killings being an all too common occurrence, and Uncle Billy's place was at the center of it. Legend tells us that murder victims were secretly buried beneath the place where the Southern Pacific Railroad tracks now lie. Uncle Billy was no stranger to violence, having personally shot dead his drunkard son-in-law for threatening the life of his daughter. As his wealth and influence increased, he brought progress to the area with the establishment of Spadra's first public school and a post office. Popular lore tells us that his fondness for the southern delicacy of roasted possum led to the marsupial's introduction into the area. Despite his penchant for occasionally settling differences with a shotgun, Uncle Billy Rubottom went to his grave a much-beloved man. Here rests Alvin Currier and his wife Susan. Married in 1881, Alvin was Susan's second husband. Her first was Uncle Billy Rubottom's son James, who died 6 years earlier. Like his friend Louis Phillips, Currier grew wealthy in land dealings and served as sheriff of Los Angeles County and then as California State Senator. The Currier Monument once stood prominently in the cemetery but now lies on its back, and the proud name carved into the stone has been chipped away by vandals. Some believe that this desecration has made the spirit of Alvin Currier grow restless and caused him to take up residence in a familiar location. In 2004, his former house was moved from the City of Industry to its present location behind the Phillips mansion. Volunteers working in the house alone have claimed to have heard footsteps and slamming doors. Disembodied voices whisper from dark corners and unoccupied rooms, prompting some to leave and never return. For many years, the ghosts of Spadra rested in peace as the small, remote cemetery became largely forgotten. Then, in the second half of the 20th century, as farmland gave way to urban development, the graveyard was rediscovered with disastrous consequences. It became a hangout for teenagers looking for a thrill. Instances of vandalism and grave robbery increased. In 1962, a Pomona boy admitted to stealing a skull from an unmarked grave at Spadra. He said it was for a school project. Sadly, this wasn't an isolated incident. In the 1980s, the cemetery became a place for cultists and devil worshippers to hold their dark rituals. They dug up the bones of people who died violently. Crosses on tombstones were smashed and painted over with satanic markings. The theft of headstones became so frequent that the Pomona Valley Historical Society began cementing them in place. The constant desecration of their resting places seemed to have upset the spirits. reports of supernatural activity soared. On moonlit nights, people have long claimed to see a woman in flowing white robes walk through the cemetery towards Elephant Hill, where she would disappear. But what old cemetery is without its tale of a woman in white? Other sightings are even more strange. In the 70s, a group of terrified teenagers reported seeing a vampire rise up from one of the graves. One would assume they were under the influence of bad drugs, but it was said that the fear in their faces was very real. Ghost stories are as old as time and have been told to keep the living away from forbidden places. But frightening tales often have the reverse effect and attract the curious and malicious alike. It is hard to imagine why some are compelled to desecrate hallowed ground. Perhaps it is their way to mock death and to declare that they have no fear of it. But perchance they are the ones who should be most fearful of all, because it very well might be that the restless spirits we see are them. If you lived in the area and have your own spooky stories about Spadra Cemetery, I'd love to read them. Please share them in the comments. I want to send out a very special thank you to the Pomona Valley Historical Society and its volunteers for hosting this amazing Halloween night event. If you want to participate in events like this, or maybe you just want to leave your mark on history, then consider donating to their organization. Every dollar they raise goes towards preserving endangered sites like Spadra Cemetery. I have put a link to their website in the description below if you are interested. Thank you for joining me on this special midnight walk. And now, here's a preview of what's coming next on Grave Explorations.